I'll go from lowest to highest for actually because each of these potentially builds on the other, and the highest one being the most likely is probably the most consequential. The lowest probability, but it's still possible this happens, is an Israeli strike on the Iranian nuclear program, which would then result in likely Iranian retaliation against Israel, potentially against the Gulf Arabs, but unlikely at this point, and possibly against the United States, depending on U.S. involvement as it's perceived. This is the least likely option because of Israel's military capabilities. They wouldn't be able to do more than set back the program by, at best, probably a couple years. At worst, maybe not at all, just because of the ranges involved and now their inability to use Saudi airspace.
Okay.
That being said, it's still possible that that's an option. The Israelis have been known, for example, the strike on the Iraqi reactor during the Iran-Iraq war. It was predicted that would set the Iraqi program back by around 6 months. It actually destroyed it. The strike was successful, but Israel has been willing in the past to gain a little bit more breathing room to authorize rather risky, aggressive offensive operations. So it's possible. Second, there's a possibility of a border dispute that escalates rather rapidly between Azerbaijan and Iran and Armenia that then spirals into a broader regional conflict. Why? Azerbaijan is squeezed between Iran and Russia. In fact, I mean, it's in the middle of the Caucasus. Mm-hmm. It's got a border with Iran. There are Azeris in Iran who, over the Iran protests last year, signaled that they do not very much like being ruled by Tehran, at least in the way they're being ruled right now. And more recently, there's been more confirmed IRGC activity in Azerbaijan. The Iranians view the Azerbaijanis as a military threat.
Right.
Also, the Russians have decreased their presence in the Lachit corridor, the link point between the two parts of Armenia, or between the two parts of the country that were agreed upon after the 2020 war, which is problematic for the Azerbaijanis because it does mean that the Armenians could push them harder if they feel like they have an opportunity. It also gives an opportunity for Iran to get involved in the mix. And finally, the Russians themselves could decide that they're tired of the Armenians working more directly with other countries that are adverse to Russian interests. We don't know, or pardon me, the Azerbaijanis working with other countries that are more adverse to Russian interests. We don't know that much about Azerbaijan's relationship with Ukraine, but Azerbaijan has a distinct relationship with Turkey. Turkey, although it's maintained ties with Russia, is a critical supplier of military equipment to Ukraine. And Azerbaijan has very strong links with Israel over its military equipment. It's entirely possible there's a pipeline between those four actors. And it's also entirely possible that gets operationalized the more Iran drifts towards Russia. And Israel feels like it has less to lose by becoming more openly involved in Ukraine. So you can see how these conditions are set for a potential border dispute between Azerbaijan and Iran, Azerbaijan and Armenia, to escalate into a broader regional problem. Finally, and I think this is the most likely of these options, a third Lebanon war between Israel and Hezbollah, which also includes Iran. Why is this, I think, the most likely of these options? Because this is the option for which both parties have an incentive to strike first, depending on the exact balance of forces. Why would Iran strike first? Because it views Israel as weak and isolated. That's been confirmed by the Saudi deal. Also, as a final layer in Israel's domestic insanity, the real problem with the government is one of the problems with the government, it's got all these parties that the Arabs perceive as extremely hostile to Muslims and Arab identity, which means that countries that previously would have been willing to engage with Israel, and even the UAE, which is normalized, see this as potentially a poison chalice for their own domestic purposes. Israel is not going to receive that much support from the Arab world if Iran escalates directly with it. Iran also has arrayed enough capabilities in Lebanon by supporting Hezbollah and in the West Bank and Gaza by using Hezbollah to smuggle weapons to Hamas and to Palestine Islamic Jihad, both of which are now overwhelmingly supported by Iran, to launch a three-front rocket war effectively against Israel. They're not going to be able to conquer Israel, but what can be done is, and this is the objective of all of these exchanges, to place the Israeli state under such extreme stress that you hollow out its military capabilities, you undermine its economy, and you break its morale. From the in Iranian propaganda.
Like, why would you do that? Like, or like, why kind of why? Okay, it's opportunistic, but why would you? You know, what's the direct benefit that you have, and why now exactly? You know, okay, there's, you know, we have a weakened kind of, you know, support from the US side for Israel, and, you know, like all sorts of things that we just discussed, but like still, like kind of why now? Why is it such a good idea? What's the incentive?
Now, so one, because Israel is because Israel is more isolated and perceived as weaker than it has been arguably since the 80s, potentially since the 60s. I don't buy the 67 argument as much personally. But that as a factor, one can't underestimate that in the Middle East. Israel post 67 and 73 has been viewed as an extremely effective, robust military power. The idea that it's not that right now and that it's more vulnerable and more ripe for pressure is something that plays very well in Middle Eastern circles that dislike Israel. Following from that, too, the fundamental Iranian objective here is to gain as much cachet as possible amongst what was once known in Washington as the Arab Street, right? To make them seem more so than Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Egypt, and Turkey as at the forefront of the Islamic world. And part of that identity as it's conceived of by the Iranian regime is at the forefront of opposition to Israel. So fighting a major war against Israel, even where you don't take territory, but where you inflict hundreds, ideally thousands of casualties on Israel, where you force Israeli civilians into bunkers, where you blow up buildings, where you disrupt economic activity, where you potentially hit ships coming into Israeli ports, all that plays really well for you regionally and makes you seem like a robust, credible regional power that other non-state armed groups and that organizations that are still more generally Arab nationalist might actually like. So those are the perception of weakness and this ideological element in the long term. The Iranians are very much thinking long term here. They don't think they're going to win immediately if they start this, but that they're able to at least score a limited victory against Israel, which they haven't been able to do effectively during their entire competition with the Israelis, very much is a motivation. But the important thing here is the Israeli side also has an incentive to strike first. Why? Because the longer you let Hezbollah hang around, the more likely that Iran is going to feed in more and more advanced capabilities to it, and the more powerful Hamas, PIJ, and other organizations are going to become. And the real danger here is, if we compare it to 2006, the last time that the Iranians and the Israelis effectively directly fought each other in Lebanon, it was naturally Hezbollah is a proxy, but the IRGC as an external action service is very much involved in Hezbollah's operations. The last time that happened, the Israelis were able to contain the war in Lebanon because Hezbollah, it had its rockets, but it didn't have nearly enough anti-ship missiles to disrupt Israeli commerce. It didn't have fast boats that were capable of harassing the now increasingly developed and in the future even more developed gas deposits and the extraction facilities in the Eastern Mediterranean, and it didn't have missiles that are more capable of penetrating and stressing Israeli air defenses and causing damage to Israeli society. And even with that, the 2006 Lebanon war was horrendous in Israeli public perception because of the casualties Israel sustained, which weren't in absolute terms or even in relative ones that great, but Israeli society is exceptionally sensitive to casualties. So the incentive for the Israelis to move on this is, at some point in the near future, the Iranians are going to feel comfortable. pushing us over the line, whether that is a full attack or a series of kidnappings, stabbings, terrorist incidents, which we have seen over the past 6 to 8 weeks. Those sorts of incidents have skyrocketed in the West Bank and in Israel proper. That means, from the Israeli point of view,
this is a little bit like a lead indicator here, right? Is that
yes?
That how
so
you
that's
think
a huge that's a huge lead indicator for something about to happen. These wars typically they don't happen. That there's a decision made, but there's always a pretext. The pretext is invariably some sort of accumulation of low-level violence over time. It's a combination of riots, kidnappings, knife crime terrorist attacks, if they can pull it off, bombings, and then the final layer, massive rocket barrages from Gaza, ideally from the West Bank if they can get them in there, and from Lebanon in retaliation for Israeli actions. So the reality of the situation now is we're getting to a point where everyone's reacting to each other in such a way that it's more and more and more likely that one of these incidents is going to set the whole powder keg off. The Lebanon contingency is the one to be most worried about, or most clued into, because it's the one where everyone's got an incentive to move if they think that war is imminent.